So in part one, we introduced the thesis of Mavrodes, the idea that morality on an atheistic worldview, a naturalistic worldview, is queer or odd or weird. And so that it would make more sense if we talk about moral obligations if God exists. And it's an argument to the best explanation, the overall idea, how do we make the best sense of morality as we know it? In part two, we're going to look a little bit more closely at one of the problems that was introduced in part one. So recall the problem. There's a problem of moral obligations because these sometimes prompt one to act in such a way that the net good to the individual, the person acting, is going to be negative. There is a loss of worldly goods when one acts morally in certain situations. So why do these moral obligations exist in the world? So let's take a closer look at an argument that we outlined very briefly and quickly in part one. So Mavrodes suggests this is one of the potential reasons why someone would say that having morality, having moral obligations makes sense on a naturalistic worldview. And this is certainly one that Kai Nielsen has endorsed. Okay, first premise, A, it's in everyone's best interest. And then we have to assume here, including mine, we'll talk about how to interpret everyone as we go through this. But it's in everyone's best interest, including my best interest, for everyone, and that would include me, to be moral. So it makes sense that it's going to be in my best interest. I'm going to be better off. It's going to be better for everyone if everyone acted morally, right? We wouldn't have rapes or murders or terrorist attacks. Everyone just acts morally. That's to our collective best interest. So therefore, it's in my best interest for everyone, and that would include me, to be moral, to act morally, to fulfill moral obligations. And therefore, we conclude C, it's in my best interest to be moral, to follow moral obligations. So that's the argument here. If C is true, then it's not so strange that there are real moral obligations in the world. It's going to be to my best interest. And then C answers this question of why should I be moral? So even if there is no God, even if you don't have any religious beliefs, this gives a defense to the oddity that Mavrodes was identifying. Why should I be moral? Now, this argument actually looks somewhat similar to an argument by Socrates when he was defending himself on trial in the Apology by Plato. Socrates said, when defending himself against the charge of corrupting youth, he said, look, I want to live around good people, moral people. It's in my own selfish interest to make the youth good people, good citizens, not bad citizens. It's in my interest that everyone be moral. And so, of course, I wouldn't intentionally corrupt their youth. I would be moral. So this reasoning is rooted in very clear reasoning of Socrates, and it has a strong history. However, having said that, there are many problems that Mavrodes identifies. So one problem is that C doesn't seem to follow from B, right? C is the claim that it's in my best interest to be moral, but that doesn't seem to follow from the claim that it's in my best interest for everyone to be moral, right? Rather, it seems to be this that follows. It's in my best interest to be moral if everyone else is moral, right? On the condition that everyone else is moral. So this is a problem because, of course, as a matter of fact, that condition is not fulfilled. It's not the case that everyone else is moral. So B isn't true, is another problem here. So I'm sorry, I didn't. B is not true is a second problem. first of all, C doesn't follow from B, but second, B itself isn't even true, that it's in my best interest for everyone, including me, to be moral. So think about a traffic example. Imagine you're driving in Chicago or a dense urban area dealing with traffic, but imagine that everyone else is practicing defensive driving techniques, just like taught in driver's ed. They're following the laws to the letter, no speeding whatsoever, no one sliding through a stop sign. Everyone's following all the traffic rules. Now, in that kind of a situation, that would be great for getting around, we might think. If everyone else were doing it, I could take advantage of that. I could go through stop signs. I could speed. I could get around and swerve in and out of other people obeying the laws. And it would be safe for me to do so because everyone else is so careful. So even though it would be good for me if everyone followed the laws, it doesn't mean that it's good for me if I follow the laws. I could get around very efficiently without doing so. Or in business, the same kind of thing. If everyone followed the laws, followed moral principles, ethical principles when engaging in business, if that's what was going on, well, it would be even easier for me to deceive people. I could lie and cheat, especially when no one else is doing it. I could most likely get away with it. People are just going to believe what I say, and I could tell them all kinds of things and make all kinds of money off of other people. So B isn't true. All right, let's follow that up a little bit. B isn't true, but it's also, as we'll see on this slide, A is false as well. So B is false because while it's true that it's best for everyone if everyone follows the rules, that doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that it's best for me if I follow the rules, right? So that's why B is false. But the third problem here is there's a problem with A. A seems to be false. Now, A was the lesson supposed to be learned from the Hobbesian rationale of Nielsen that we talked about in part 1 that we just mentioned. So A is the claim that it's in everyone's best interest, including mine, for everyone, including me, to be moral, right? That would be a great society if everyone was moral. The challenge here, as we hinted at when we first went through this, is A can be interpreted in two different ways, depending on whether the first everyone is taken collectively or distributively. Does it mean everyone as a whole, it's good for all people as a whole, or does it mean it's for every individual? And the distinction here, just to be clear, if A is taken in the collective sense, it's true of everyone broadly, then B isn't going to follow from it. It doesn't necessarily follow that it's true for me as an individual, right? So what's true of the whole may not be true of the components. So while A says it's in everyone's best interest for everyone to be moral, in the collective sense, it doesn't follow that you end up with this claim that it's to my advantage to be moral, right? So if A means is everyone in A is understood this in this broad collective sense, B doesn't follow from it. So we saw that if A is taken collectively, that's problematic because B doesn't follow from it. But if A is taken in the distributive sense, B would follow from it. Okay, then you get B following from it. But A taken distributively seems to be clearly false. It's just not true for every individual that it's in their own best interest to be moral. So a Hobbesian response to being moral fails in this Russellian world. There seems to be good reason to think that Nielsen's approach is not going to succeed. This argument fails. So in a Russellian world, morality remains weird, odd, because there are moral obligations that do not promote the good of those who are fulfilling the obligations. You are required to do things that result in a loss to you of the goods available in that world. So this seems to be problematic. The obligations then that we talk of are actually very superficial. It doesn't make sense to act morally from a rational egoist point of view, right? As we showed with the business example, the traffic example. If this is all there is in the world, and happiness is the worldly goods available without God, then why wouldn't you try to get those for yourself, right? And not worry about other people's goods, right? Another odd thing about morality in a Russellian world is that it's superficial, right? If this evolutionary story makes sense, you may feel like there are moral obligations. You may even believe that there are moral obligations, but there really aren't, right? There are no deep moral obligations on this account of morality. And yet those superficial moral claims seem to demand great sacrifice of individuals from time to time, right? We give up opportunities to acquire goods, to have control over the people for the sake of this very superficial morality. Okay, there seem to be only two alternatives left that would make sense then. Mavrodes says the atheistic worldview doesn't make sense. It can't account for true moral obligations. So what would? One would be to affirm the oddity in this way, but say that there's a Platonic obligations that we have to fulfill. There's a Platonic conception of the world where it's simply a fact that there are moral obligations. Okay, that may be odd, but that's the way the world is. One could go that route, Mavrodes suggested, and that would make sense. Now, that's not going to be a Russellian world. That's not a naturalistic world. That's a world where you have these non-physical, right, just obligations that are just there, and we're required to fulfill them, right? It doesn't come from any evolutionary basis. It's not part of the natural world. It's not part of the physical world, but it's just there. Now, so that's not actually a Russellian world, but one could take that path. And initially, Bertrand Russell seemed to take that path, although, as we already discussed, he later saw that that was problematic and gave it up. So the other alternative left would be to accept a religious conception of the world, to believe that God exists and that God is the foundation for moral obligations. And Mavrodes says that, look, if you consider these as the two options, then B is more reasonable than A. So we have the fulfillment of the argument to the best explanation. How do we explain the deep moral obligations that actually exist in the world? It's because God exists and God is the foundation of that morality.